Hello, and welcome to another discussion of composable CMSs and how to evaluate and buy them. And with me, as before, is Tim Benix. And
Hello.
hello, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about content management systems, APIs, CDNs, cloud hosting, edge personalization, all that fun stuff. So it's really all of the things that you need to know for getting content in and out of your content management system. And so we'll talk today about a few things. First, let's talk about APIs. And I know, Tim, you are very opinionated on the subject of APIs.
I love it because every episode you introduce me and then you're like, Tim, you're pretty opinionated on this one. I'm like, yep, and say yes on all of them.
It's a polite way of saying Dutch, maybe. You're very
Yeah,
Dutch.
perhaps. Maybe before we dive in, people can actually scan this QR code or follow the link below to download our CMS guide on how to evaluate them. And so this is one of those places where it's all nicely structured. And then in these streams, we grab a little piece of that and then we just have a lovely discussion. And in this case, a lot of Tim opinion, apparently. I like it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for remembering to do that. We've done enough of these things that I keep forgetting the intro.
Well, it's these CTAs that we have to put in, right?
Yes, yeah, that's true. Okay, so let's see. First, let's talk at a high level about the APIs that we're going to be talking about. And I've categorized a couple here, but even as we were discussing this beforehand, you said there might be more of these. And I sort of noted typically content management systems have two or more types of APIs, but usually they'll have these two, and those are content management APIs. Sometimes you'll see them referred to as a CM API and content delivery APIs. And I think this is a really important distinction because when people are talking about performance and uptime and content delivery networks, they're almost always talking about content delivery. And the funny thing is, if people are running into performance issues with headless CMSs, it's almost always with a content management API. And a content management API is really an API that you'll use to create, update content, import content, and often a content management API by necessity will be slower because what's happening is you're getting that content, you're adding those things, you're putting them into a database, and it's a much more live dynamic API. And you usually can't do a lot of the performance enhancing things like caching and content delivery networks that you can with content delivery APIs. And so often there's a real disconnect in performance there. And so it's something that people need to be aware of, that if your use case means that your composable content management system is connecting deep with other systems and other systems are writing content to your CMS system, or you're doing a bulk import of content, the performance and the performance bottlenecks on that content management API may be fairly important. And so I want to get that out of the way first, and then talk a little bit about content delivery APIs. And then, Tim, you also mentioned that a lot of CMSs also have a few other APIs potentially related to content rendering and delivery.
Well, yeah, there's sometimes these differences, especially when it comes to the GraphQL endpoints, where, of course, GraphQL, when you do a query like that, you always, or most of the time, because there are some other options, but you have to do a post. And a post you cannot cache locally, right? So you have to do a post and then get that data back. And by nature, these APIs are super dynamic. So suddenly you have a CD, a content delivery API that is super dynamic because whatever fields you want, it has to output that, right? So there's an extra complexity layer there. And you see that certain CMSs then have like, okay, this is a hyper cached version of whatever we do there. And so it's more stuck to like a TTL or something like that. And then there's a normal one. And then I've also seen where some of the CM endpoints, so the content management ones, are maybe less important because they just get hit less. But then I've had to do it recently where I had to import like 200 items into a CMS. And I needed to do like a 1200 millisecond timeout between requests to be able to even not bottleneck the whole thing.
Mhm.
And so the more enterprisey you go, the more important these CM endpoints become, right? This management stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. And if your content management system use case dictates that you're simply using their web application to create content and that's all you're ever going to do, you may not use the content management API at all.
And most of the
Similarly,
time it doesn't exist, or
yeah,
it only exists partly. And I've had it so often that we are speaking to some CMS vendors, and then I needed to do something with an import or a
mm,
change, and then they're like, yeah, we have this internal API, but it's not open, maybe you can
yeah,
hack it. Like, sure, I'll hack it. Let me just grab Postman and my session token and see. And it's kind of funny how often that happens.
yeah. No, absolutely. I think we're sort of talking about this as we think it's table stakes, but in a lot of cases it's not. And to your point, depending upon how enterprisey the CMS is, it may not have those APIs at all. Um, what else within that? I think it also sometimes you get some interesting cases where if you are working with a content management API and you're writing to that API and then you're querying from that content delivery API, there's often a delay because
Yeah,
what'll happen is
true.
you'll save that content gets sent to the CDN and then it's the CDN that's serving up the content and that's not immediate. And so sometimes if you're writing an enterprise application that's some external system that's writing to that content management system API, if you're then sort of continuing to work with that asset, in a lot of ways you need to continue to work with the content management API because you can't depend upon that asset or that content item actually have being pushed to the content
I
delivery
have to
API.
be honest, I have not experienced that in about 5 years, I think. In a certain system where you would
Yeah,
host it yourself, that we both know what we talk about, but we won't mention, that happened all the time. And we
yeah,
would do our whole development, UAT and QA phase just on this CM server that was also able to deliver some stuff, but just slower.
yeah.
Because it was just too much stuff to sync and all that. But nowadays, when everything is in the cloud, especially with the more cloud native CMSs that have a great CDN in front,
Hmm.
adding stuff into the CDN is almost runtime and almost per field. So I haven't had that issue in a while. But I guess when you grow and go more enterprise and you have more different things that are syncing, suddenly the syncing aspect that takes time becomes very important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. um Let's see here. So I think we've kind of exhausted everything people should know about content management APIs. Let's talk a little bit about content delivery
Sure.
APIs and particularly CDNs. So I think this is one of the um, interesting areas of differentiation for some vendors as well. And I think it is one of those things that you need to evaluate closely to understand what your need is, because CDNs are expensive, and you as a client will be paying for that capability. And if you don't necessarily need it for a particular geography or particular performance, or even if you're using your content management system for static rendering, you may not need a CDN at all. So let's discuss some of those issues.
Well, again, I haven't actually seen, at least in my personal projects, any issues with that. It's that good with these SaaS CMS providers. I
Mhm.
guess almost all of them, that it's so good that I don't even consider, hey, is this on a CDN or not? Because the response is always quite fast. However, I've been learning more and more recently. Of course, we'll talk about that later a bit when we talk about Netlify and Vercel, that things are now not always static
Mhm.
rendering anymore. The Jamstack is kind of, it still exists, but there's many more flavors now where you can do server-side rendering with a caching layer in front that sometimes might query and other times it might not. And then I've now noticed when you hit a certain CDN that for an API endpoint, but you do it through maybe a CDN edge handler on Vercel from France.
Mhm.
That round trip actually takes pretty long, even though the API and the CDN from the vendor is really fast. And so we have now exploded in options where things can go wrong or go right, and where, let's say, a year ago, where we most of us did like all these SSR type or SSG type projects, I haven't even thought about performance,
Mhm.
right? And then the thing is, that's quite funny when you're then in a local development state, you don't do static rendering. It's all like completely dynamic because you're locally developing. And then some CMSs surprised you by how fast their API responses are, and then others you're like, oh, this I did not expect this at all. I won't name names here because it's not worth it. There's a whole CMS evaluation guide where you can find everything. But it's really interesting to see, and that you're pleasantly surprised that suddenly your local development setup is really fast, and that's just
Mhm.
because these endpoints are super super fast. And so I guess it's just CMSs need to know their target audience, how they build projects,
Mhm.
and then just deliver the features that they require based on SLAs and whatever feature requests. And it's right now it's a bit of a wild west, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited about it, to be fair.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of options and a lot of differentiation here. I think this is one of those areas where I think, and this is my opinion, we're seeing most of the differentiation. Um, obviously there's some other areas of differentiation, but it usually tends to be this. I think what happens is, some agency or some company will be looking at some CD or some CMS and be like, oh, it would be nice if some of the API behavior did this a little bit differently, and then they go off and invent another CMS.
Oh, I've seen many
So
of those.
yeah,
I love it.
exactly.
I probably all front end devs that were a little bit like leaning back end, like me. We've all built our own CMS before, and then
Yeah.
just trashed it for one project. But still,
Yeah. Let's see here. Another area of differentiation for content delivery is preview APIs.
oh yeah,
Um,
like, but that's just draft state, I imagine, of a certain item, right?
yeah, but I think that's important to note. Sometimes you'll have three states of an item, right? You'll have
Yep.
that original copy, and then you will have something that's work in progress. So you're making changes, but you're not necessarily committing that version back to that system, and you're not necessarily publishing yet, but you still want to preview it. And so often CMSs will have a preview API capability.
Yeah.
And again, this one is interesting and may be fairly complex, and you may need to dig into the details, because that preview API, when you're calling it, you may be previewing that the single item that you're working on. But if that preview also has components that are working with other items, the state of those other items may be served from either like that content delivered version or a content management version. So
Oh
sometimes
yeah,
you get
it can go
weird,
crazy.
yeah,
Exactly.
sometimes you get weird sync states,
Yeah.
depending upon where those other items are. And this is, I think, one of the hidden complexities again of headless systems, certainly relative to digital experience platforms. I know, when we were using Sitecore, when you were previewing something in the context of a page, there was a lot of capabilities around saying, okay, it would actually know the state of all those items. You could
True.
rewind the clock to say, oh, okay, what do all these items look like at a certain point in the past, or what do all these items look like at a certain point in the future? And that was some really very useful and powerful preview capability.
Yeah, I think Sidecore, that we have to give them props here. That's
mm,
amazing. Like their component based data templates and versioning, and then smart publish and publish everything, or publish a group and then go back in time. That stuff is unrivaled.
yeah.
And right now, when I use different headless CMSs, you can see they're all trying to tackle this issue in slightly different ways. And then sometimes when you hit publish, you get a little pop-up that says there's a few items in draft.
Yep.
Do you now just want to publish all of them? And then others don't do that. You go and preview your page, and then suddenly this image is not showing up because they don't have that workflow, or you cannot customize that workflow. And then in your API, you might not get something back, and you just don't know why.
Yeah,
Oh
exactly.
man.
So, yeah, I think it's really important to point out, because this is one of those areas that, especially for folks coming from CMSs like Drupal, Acquia, Sitecore, a lot of that capability, because they're monolithic. That's actually one of the benefits of a monolithic system. You
Right.
have context and understanding of literally everything within that system, including your assets, and so you can do these things properly. In a headless world, you've got to figure that out. To Tim's point, or to your point, I always speak to you as in the third person in these things. To your point,
That's
um,
fine. It's like we're on a panel. We're good.
a panel of two.
Yes.
Uh, to your point, um, that's geez, I lost my train of thought now. Um, anyways, it's
Third person. No, sorry. How about I go into another thing that always grinds my gears, and then maybe you can come back to what you had before.
sure.
So this is interesting, right? When you're evaluating a CMS or a headless thing in the composable space, have a look at what their
Oh, I think we lost Tim. Okay, well, Tim's internet is getting sorted out.
I
I
think I'm
remember.
back. Am
Oh,
I
there
back?
you are. Okay, yes, you're
Oh,
back.
if you were speaking, please continue. I'll do my rant after.
Okay, what I was going to say is, um, as you mentioned, where headless CMSs are starting to build some of those components, and you mentioned that example of, you've got your content item that's referencing other things in draft, and they'll start to say things like, "Oh, do you want to publish those other items as well?" They're also starting to do things like grouped publishing, where you can say, "Oh, I want to group these things and schedule that." So it's not quite as powerful, for example, as what Sitecore had, which had that sort of timeline ability, but it's certainly getting there to the point that it will help you start to build and preview things and sort of understand the context of everything in that package of content, for lack of a better word, that you're sending along. Let's see, Richard
Yeah, I'll put
Bowser.
it back on here. Yeah,
Yeah. Preview is often challenging because your content is not validated and requires defensive coding. Um, yeah, that's definitely one of the issues with preview. And it was kind of related to what we were talking about earlier, that
exactly.
you need to make sure that that context of everything else that you're linking to is validated. And yeah, you need to take that into account. This was, again, one of the nice things that systems would have done for you in the past, and you need to figure that out for yourself. Now, again, if that preview capability and the context of all those other assets is less important, then that's something that you don't necessarily need to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. I do want to come back to stuff with code, right? When you
Mhm.
do query these things in certain or in draft or whatever, that's one problem. But then the next one is that I just started to speak about when my internet disconnected because I'm in the countryside. um, Basically what that means is like, how do the creators of this CMS think about APIs and
Mhm.
results, and what is REST, or is it GraphQL, or is it some sort of strange mix, which we see quite often? Because as you know, REST is relatively strict. Normally you just
Mhm.
get back one result, and if that's 5,000 lines and you need five, it is what it is. But more often than not, you need more than what you can get back.
Mhm.
And so they have to start thinking about, okay, how do we then include extra fields, or how do we include modifiers for filtering?
Yeah.
And lots of the times, these things are literally just equations as strings,
Yes.
which is really hard to test in your code. There's almost like, how do you unit test that? Well, you can, but you have to interpret that somehow. And then on the CMS end of things, they have to also write interpreters for that. There's almost like query builders and all
Mhm.
string creators. Like, I remember back in the PHP days when we created query builders for MySQL and stuff. It's almost the same now on these API levels. And then it just gets really hard and really opinionated really fast, where you have a company like Sanity investing in something like Grok queries.
Mhm.
It's an amazing language to query in, and it works very well, but it's such a strange thing that you have to actually learn that, so you now become a sanity specialist.
Yeah.
That kind of sucks when you have to change or do another job. You have all this extra knowledge, right?
Yeah, well, and that's a really interesting point about philosophy in general of APIs. I think, to your point, there's more and more that you can be baking into an API. Things like pagination, things like control over referenced fields and getting the
Yeah,
content of those referenced fields into a single query. Um,
exactly.
but to your point, the flip side of that is that now becomes more and more proprietary to the query of that CMS. And so the more you do that, the more your front end code becomes coupled to that CMS. And it makes it hard if you were going to change systems, all of those sort of specialty functions around pagination and references and things like that all of a sudden break.
Yeah, so lots more code to write. And but on top of that, imagine you are the CMS, right? You have written all these very proprietary, amazing things that make developers love your system, and you need to do an update or you need to change something. How do you then deprecate a field or one of those operators? You're creating your own technical debt almost.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like it's very complicated because then if you do, let's say, something like a GraphQL API that's more dynamic, then you're dealing with the performance downfalls of that thing. And then also developers not liking it because it's GraphQL and needing a lot more, I don't know, like the whole kitchen sink, you have to throw at it on your front end to be able to query that easily. And so there's almost no good way. And what I would love to do, I'm not sure how we can do this, but there needs to be a way that REST APIs are this way. I never ever want to see anymore an error with a 200 header. Like, why? Or
Yeah.
anything in .NET where you go to a 404 that first goes to a 200, then redirects you with a 302 to a 404. All that kind of craziness is happening also on API level. And so we need to kind of get it to be more structured. And what I love about working at Uniform, where we just really use JSON schema to really signify what things are and how they connect. And that's how all our data types and connections happen through this JSON schema thing. And that's a really interesting way. It's also really hard to build. Luckily, Uniform has really good developers that can do these things. That is just, I don't know how to say this in that's not Dutch and not rude. Anyways, it's
Go on,
great.
be Dutch, Tim.
Now I will not say this, but it's really nice to work at a place that really takes that seriously, especially because data comes from different places, and we somehow need to serve that, right? And so the more composable you get and the more APIs you have to deal with, the harder it gets in your front end code, right? And you need to somehow figure out to super cleanly solve that. And you can solve it code first by having like an API team where you proxy all these things and you make cleaners and data mappers and all that stuff. You see that quite often on bigger companies. Or you use something like a DXC where you don't have to do these queries and you just assign what data you need to each component. But that's not for this stream. But it's very interesting to see that all these APIs are different. And so make sure that you understand the opinions that your developers have to be able to choose that system. And that's a pretty big part next to a content editor that has to be happy. If a developer is unhappy, you will just not get as good as results.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. I am one of those. It's just, yeah.
I think that is kind of, in a nutshell, the point of this whole discussion. Every API and sort of system has different philosophies and different opinions, and in a lot of ways they're all compromises, right? If you're leaning into one direction, you're going to sacrifice things in another direction. And so there's really not the sense of like, oh, this is the one way to do it. It really is, this is the way that we think works well for this use case. And again, to your point, Tim, your developers are going to be the ones that are really understanding the use case and what this thing needs to integrate with and what it needs to do, and therefore they'll be looking at the APIs from that perspective, right?
And also what's really interesting is when you start evaluating these CMSs, just have a developer with you and ask questions. Because I've been in meetings where we had the CMS on, where they did not expect us to assume that their content delivery API was for high volume. They're like, we didn't build it for that. It's like, why not? You're a CMS. And so you always need to talk to these people to figure out how did they mean this thing, because we don't have a standard,
Yeah.
right? And so understand how these things work, because the moment you are a huge high volume player, you might want to just put everything in something like Algolia that has an index that has a 3 millisecond return of everything that you want. That might be a lot easier. Like if you do it the right way, Algolia can be the fastest CMS in history.
Yeah.
Not saying you should do that, but you can. And it's really interesting to see all the possibilities.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point, and it's gonna I'm gonna sort of go on a little bit of a tangent,
Here we
and
go.
well, I'm gonna talk a little bit about platforms for content operations and content marketing. So something like
Mhm.
Gather Content, or what used to be Welcome Software, now the Optimizely content marketing platform. Those are systems that are designed for content creation and workflow and scheduling and things like that. They're not designed to deliver content, and so their APIs for delivery, to your point, were never designed or intended to be high performance in the same sense of something like, say, Contentful. And so,
Yeah.
you can be using these things and it'll feel like a CMS, and the APIs will kind of look like a CMS. It'll have REST APIs for getting content out, but it'll lack the performance. It'll lack things like pagination and linking and all the stuff that makes a content management system really more aligned for the delivery and distribution of that content. I
Yeah.
think
Exactly.
on the rant, content management system is kind of a horrible way of describing what a lot of systems do,
Oh,
because
very true. Very true. It's
uh,
essentially everything is content management and nothing.
yes, exactly. So I think that's a whole other 1 hour discussion, and I won't get far into that, but I did want to expand on your point, Tim.
Well, we can definitely think about something like a PIM system, right? Where
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
enrich your product data. Like I know PIM systems with like hundreds of API endpoints to enrich data, to fetch data, and to do stuff, but async. And
Yeah.
I personally only know one that can do it in runtime, which is Bluestone PIM, which is a Mac
Mhm.
Alliance partner. These guys somehow figured out they have like 500 endpoints by default for all types of product enhancements, enrichments, querying, matching things up. It's ridiculously awesome.
Mhm.
And so it's not that normal for people in that space to have delivery APIs. They kind of
Yeah.
have just management APIs, right?
Yep. Yeah. And again, so you then need to figure out what you're using for delivery, and
Yes.
maybe we mentioned digital experience composition systems. Uniform is great for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
In some cases, you'll be doing things like static rendering, and I think this is probably a good point to talk about the next point of the discussion.
Yes.
um, Delivery, cloud hosting, companies like Netlify and Vercel. Tim, again,
These are
with
my
your Dutch
favorites.
opinions, your favorite things. Let's talk
Well,
about.
the thing is, well, favorites. I, for me, it's like I just said. There's like an explosion of awesomeness when it comes to delivering your websites right now. Maybe not even websites, but even all your apps or wherever stuff comes from. And a few years ago, we had the more old school DXPs plus the WordPresses of this world that would literally just have an SSR project, so server rendered pages on runtime, that they just bang a CDN in front, and it's somehow one every 10 visits becomes an actual page that is server side rendered, and the rest is just in the CDN. But then where there was this whole other thing that became even faster, where it's all like they called it Jamstack. And what Jamstack means, let's not go into it because that's an hour-long conversation, but at least it's very interesting to see how things have changed now, where you had statically rendered pages where on the build it would make a static page and then just put it on the CDN. And so you would effectively only have HTML, CSS, JavaScript media. So it's not hackable, or not really. And it's super fast and all that stuff. Hey, we have Diego. Let me just put that on here. What's up, dude? Nice to see you again. Anyways, so Of course, the Vercels and Netlify's of this world, they jumped on that bandwagon, and Netlify even coined the term Jamstack, and they were in that space, and they changed the game because the main thing about how all that works is that they simplified the DevOps process by,
Hmm.
if I could say it personally, 1,000%.
Yeah.
Like the moment I started using, and it was back then, it was more Netlify, and Vercel didn't have that name even yet. It was called Site, I think. I figured out, okay, we have these serverless functions. And now we can connect things up in the backend and then somehow in one code base, without writing a line of extra DevOps related stuff, have no CI and CD servers. Just have a Git. I push my code and it literally just gets deployed and
Hmm.
everything works. I had this moment of like, holy crap, the internet just redefined itself. And I had that about, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago.
It's
And
it's funny. Just to interrupt, I was talking to an analyst at the start of Jamstack and the start of headless
Mhm.
CMS. And, like me, they had been around for a long time, back to the original decoupled CMSs like
Yeah.
Interwoven Team Site that would do similar functions. You'd have
Yeah.
your CMS, you'd render out static HTML and CSS, and you'd push it to the server, and it would be very unhackable.
FTP.
FTP or
Yeah.
TeamSite had this function called Open Deploy, which would do
Oh
things
yeah.
like diffs and make it easy. And they were asking me like, well, what's the difference between what's just coming out and what was 15 years ago? And
Probably
I
not much, right?
well, architecturally and philosophically very similar, but to your point, the actual tools and performance and just usability of it from a developer perspective was insane, like a
Yeah.
100x multiplier. In
Maybe a
it,
thousand, like I just mentioned.
yeah,
It's like I didn't like I'm old enough to have set up CI/CD servers with Jenkins, and then you would do a build in a Docker container, or not even before Docker. I don't even know how they did it, in the temp folder, perhaps. Then
yeah,
you would grab that output and then secure FTP it to a server, and then hope it would work. And then does the load balancer understand it has to go to 5 places? Like all these things, I'm old enough to have done that. And then when we switched to the more simple things, it just changed the game so much. And I love these companies that decided, you know what? It's the modern times are here. We have enough cheap hardware we can use in the
hmm,
cloud and off the cloud, um, to make developer experience the most important part.
yeah,
And they have made it a revolution, because now I can use a headless CMS that just sits there. It's there. It's just an API. And then if I want to deploy something, I just build something locally quickly and then just push it to that place by committing to Git, or literally dragging and dropping my files, and it's done.
yeah,
And that changed the game, because now everybody who's junior can use the magic.
yeah.
And
Oh, Tim, your audio's
I'm back.
there you go.
They often don't think inside of the box because they haven't had a box to build yet, and suddenly
Yeah.
innovation starts. And um, did you want to say something before I move into the next tangent?
No, I mean, I was going to joke that, to your point, even a generation ago, CMS wise, developers used to require laptops that were basically servers in
Oh
order
yeah, I
to.
remember that. I was
And
one of those.
yeah, and now, again, to your point, everything's done in the cloud. You can basically be running very little performance wise on your laptops. And now I joke that product managers need better laptops because they have to
Yes, they
have,
do.
you
They have
know,
to run the whole thing.
well, PowerPoint and Excel docs and
Yeah,
all these
yeah,
other
yeah.
things. So it's the product managers that need the high computing
And
applications.
it
And
goes even further now. Take
yeah,
companies like Code Sandbox that are pushing team development environments on the browser in the cloud with WebAssembly.
yeah,
Or I might say it wrong, but something like that. And it's so ridiculously fast and easy. These guys are pushing the limit one more. I can just go on my iPhone and code, right? So, what was my tangent about? I was ready to go in, and now it's
oh,
somehow
sorry, I
moved this.
preempted
Oh,
you.
we'll get there. But
Yeah,
it's like, what I really enjoy is that they were able to, that the tech was far enough that they could use it and put developer focus first, And then these companies can grow and they make this amazing platform where they can just say, hey, but wouldn't it be cool if we also just could put a form on this website and just send it to our server? Done.
Mhm.
Why not? Or wouldn't it be easy to have some analytics? Put it in for cell analytics. Best thing that happened recently. And so, of course, there's a lot more we can discuss on that, but maybe let's wait for that for a sec. Let's see what else did we have here.
Well, I was going to say, while we're talking about those functions that are being built, is it worth talking about static site rendering or some of the other techniques that we're
Yeah,
seeing?
sure. That on its own, I've been contemplating on making a YouTube video that's relatively long about all the ways you can render your front end.
Hmm.
And then there's so many, and it's changing so fast that that video would be out of um, being informative like in 2 weeks. And so I think what's really important to talk about now is like there's just this pendulum that goes back and forth, right? So we started with these static sites, we FTP'd them up, then it became all like runtime rendering with the .NET stuff and then the PHP stuff, and then even with Node.js, and then now the pendulum swung back, and now it was all Jamstack sites with extra fancy drizzled on top with JavaScript. And now we're somewhere in between where you see companies like Astro that are amazing at rendering something statically and then render it, but then they're adding SSR back into it. And then, of course, like there's the usual suspects like Next.js that did this like amazing React server components thing, where essentially each component can be almost like a little application that queries some stuff, and then together it becomes a page, and that is then cached. And
Hmm.
then you can say, how fast does this uncache after a certain amount of user or a certain amount of time? And that becomes a dynamic page, but it somehow grabs different subjects from other things that you can use to make it awesome. And I think Nuxt, right before that, was pioneering this whole thing, and well, Next did the same. It's a similar time frame where they had a statically rendered web page, but then every subsequent page that you would load, it became as an SPA. So a single page app that only ran on JavaScript. And then you had like this weird hybrid that was best of both worlds. And now you're going to see even more because Nuxt.js also came out with server components in Vue. And so it's all over the place now. And it's up to you to choose. And if you are a Vercel customer and you use Next.js, you're in a really good spot. Just use their stuff. Do
Hmm.
it the way they say, because this is the one thing that I, as a front end dev, really enjoy now. Like I used to have to know everything about performance to be able to make a website perform. Follow the browser guidelines, figure out the tricks of the trade to make sure that images are lazy loading or fonts
Hmm.
are optimized or whatever streams in when. And now that's almost just, is that word ambiguous? It's just normal now. Like I recently rebuilt my website in Next.js, hosted on Vercel, because I just wanted to see the magic. The only thing I did for performance optimization is say this image is lazy loading and this one is not. And I had 100% score on Core Web Vitals without doing anything. And so it becomes very normal now. So I would almost say is let go of your previous ideas of how I used to build it. This is the way to
Hmm.
go. Just kind of follow how these meta frameworks come up with stuff combined with their CDNs and their services and their APIs and things like that. And you will just build the best things. And then you have more brain space to actually do the stuff you want to be working on.
Yeah,
And
I think that's a really important point, because certainly on social media, you often see this discussion like, oh my God, building web applications is so complex and there's all these dependencies and you need to
well,
know
it
all of these
is.
things.
But
And it is, you're right. But to your point, you now get a lot of that and you don't have to think about these things. Previously, yes, web was very simple. It was HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of JavaScript on top,
well,
and
that was
that's,
not simple on its own because
well,
browsers were mental back then. But okay.
yeah, but you didn't have all these dependent frameworks and
Mhm.
includes and things like that. And but I think that is the trade-off now, is DDoSs are the thing, or a thing of the past. You don't have to think about that. Load balancing, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to think about caching strategy in the same sense
Well,
that you did before.
interesting. You might have to, because Vercel has got it wrong recently a few times, quite publicly, where somebody's bill became 15 grand after an hour
Right.
because some system had a loop that kept going recursively. There's some stuff there, but they're really good at replying to that and responding fast and helping you out.
Yeah.
So, as a developer who doesn't know about all the stuff you just mentioned, you're kind of good. And then when you go to a scale, like a friend of mine, Josh, works at a car company where they have, like, I don't know, 700K SKUs
Hmm.
products, and it's all in CMSs and search indexes, and scale suddenly becomes a thing. Then you need to know again, but now you have great tools,
Yeah.
right? That's a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Uh, let's see here. Maybe, I mean, we've talked about it a lot
Yes.
in the discussion. How these things differ from previous hosting models. We're mentioning things like load balancing and some of those dynamic systems.
It's no
So
longer in the basement.
yes, exactly. No, it's funny. I was thinking about that again. Back in the day when I was developing stuff on TeamSite, and I did not have to think about these things. Yes, I was managing the CMS. Yes, I was managing the build of these things. But then once I was using Open Deploy to get that stuff to the server, that was an infrastructure team.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so
Yeah.
and I think it might have actually been in our own basement for all I know when I was at
Oh
Business
yeah,
Optimists.
I've had, like, even till 2018 or 2019, when I was still at the agency, we had these projects where the customer said, "Okay, these are the servers you have, but you know what? We cloned everything because this one, the first one, after 5 hours, the memory fills up so much it stops being able to serve stuff. So then you reboot that one and you open up the next one
Yeah,
that would then fill up for 5 hours,
that's
and then
that's
you
the failover, and they just keep
yeah, and then
swapping
you
back.
just script the swap."
Uh,
Right?
that's
We've
hilarious.
been around this stuff, but luckily now we that's a lot less.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So yeah.
Maybe we should, as the last subject, talk a bit about what edge personalization actually means, or whatever edge means. Maybe do you want to take a crack at explaining edge?
Oh God, no, no.
Ah,
That's
well, then I have to do it, and I only have my personal experience and my viewpoint as a developer to talk about. But maybe we can just keep it as simple as possible, and then if there's anyone in the audience who wants to mention something about what I say wrong, feel free. So essentially, what we like about a CDN edge, the edge is like on the, I don't know how you could explain it, but it's like on the outskirts of the CDN, as close to the user as
Mhm.
possible. That's the main thing. If something is on a CDN edge, you can expect it to be very close. I'm in the countryside in France, so I'm assuming the next big city is Toulouse. That's probably where my CDN edge lives.
Mhm.
So if I now go to and I need a specific piece of content or data, it comes from there. So it's decentralized, distributed on the edge. And lately, the edge has become more powerful. There's been a lot more things going on, but because essentially what they wanted to do before is the edge had to be the fastest ever, right? It had to be like 10 milliseconds, you get your stuff. So what that means is that these servers that were running edge were slow. Well, they weren't slow, but they were simplified so they would be fast.
Mhm.
So you couldn't run certain operations on them because it would take too long.
It would just serve content.
Yeah, static content without too many headers attached,
Yep.
simple stuff, no compute. And then you had serverless functions that would be close to the edge, but not really. They would do all the compute stuff.
Mhm.
And however, maybe about a year ago, we started to realize, what if we could do more on this edge? Wouldn't that be amazing? Because then I could run on an edge in France something for me that's specific to me. And then you would have an edge in Canada close to where you are that would do something specific to you. And that becomes very interesting. And so they had to figure out, how can we make these edge networks, these servers, they sit there, right? How can we make them fast enough and simple enough to still be fast, but give you compute or give you, like, if else capabilities or
Mhm.
something fancy, right? That you can push to them. And this is when they started, especially Netlify did that really well. And now Vercel came up as well. And I think Cloudflare is good. Like, Azure is coming out soon with it. A lot of companies have this now because these edge networks existed. They just had to make them smarter. And so they started to run very lightweight Node.js or Python services on there that didn't have all the features. Like you could not actually have a file storage. You cannot
Mhm.
touch a file. Or you couldn't do certain operations because it just takes too much time. And so they have like maybe it's no longer Node.js, but it's Bun or it's Dino because it's a much lighter executable. And this is a very long way to get to the point where we are right now, where you can do a whole bunch of things on that edge. And especially the most famous ones are Cloudflare's Epic, and they are the most liberal with what you can do on the edge. It's the easiest to use. Well, maybe I shouldn't say these things anymore because in the end, it's all easy to use. And then Vercel and Netlify have come up, and there's a few others. Akamai also even does it, but
Mhm.
it's their old style. So it's a challenging, but it works.
Mhm.
And what you can do now is every request you send as a user that uses a website to whatever that website is running on has a function that pushes it through an edge handler. And
Mhm.
we and they sometimes when you're in like Next.js, they call this a middleware file. So essentially is whatever URL you go to, it goes through the edge first and then it renders your page. And so if you don't do anything on the edge, it's really fast because it returns nothing. But what's very interesting is you have a bit of information in that function. What is the location of this user? What is
Mhm.
their, I don't know, maybe their device information or maybe whatever. And so what comes in it's actually streamed. So the HTML that you might want to serve to that user is also available in that edge function. So what you can do, if you do that smartly and in a fast way, you can actually say, okay, I'm getting all the HTML now for that request. And maybe I want to change that a little bit and stream in the fact that I'm in France or the fact that I'm in Canada and
Mhm.
then do something else on that page and then return that as a package of what the actual HTML is. So you have dynamic rendering on that edge with the information of the user at that edge point. And then suddenly things get magical, right? You can do edge side personalization that is hyper fast because you just stream in little bits. But you can also do other things where something like Next.js, the Vue.js framework that looks like Next, but is, in my opinion, super fun. It's my favorite. It can run fully on the edge. You can literally have a dynamic Next app running on an edge server, which is ridiculous. There's literally no origin anymore
Mhm.
because it's so small and it fits so well with these runtimes like Dino or Bun or whatever they run, that you can do hyper dynamic things like that. And I can talk for a few more hours on how fun that is, but maybe that's not for today. But
Well,
the game changed again. Let's say it
yeah.
like that.
So I think it's worth talking about then how do we at Uniform use edge functions to enable personalization? Because I think that's, to your point, those cloud networks and CDNs and edge is enabling that use case, but you've got to do some work to get that to happen. So,
Well, in Uniform, not so much, which is what makes it so lovely. Like the Uniform SDK is relatively light. You add it to your web page or your project, and it connects to Uniform, obviously, so it gets all the data, including personalization information. And so maybe I can talk about Uniform's personalization for the client side initially.
mhm,
So if you did it with JavaScript, no CDN edges involved, and then how that is moved to the edge.
yeah.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, my Uniform colleagues, if you're in the chat. I'm just going to give the high level overview because we're not going to give away too much of the IP also. Right? That's not what we're here for. There's still a bunch of magic that's ours. But anyways, initially when the way Uniform works with personalization is that there's not that many rules. We don't really like rules because you have to be a PhD in rule making if you have 15 components you want to personalize based on certain users, right? It's really hard to if this then that and put all that in. So what Uniform does is there's a tracker on the web page that knows what people do. What URL did they press? Where did they scroll to? Did they go to a specific place and then liked something or put something in the basket? And there's all these, you can almost, if you're a developer, you might understand this. If you're integrating with an analytics tool like Google Analytics, you add events for all actions people do, right? So That's also kind of how Uniform tracks people. And you can choose to store this information in a cookie or in the session or in like local database or just in memory. And so when people refresh the page, the personalization is gone. And every time people give signals, Uniform figures out, okay, so there's a signal that somebody liked a certain thing. So when I now go back to the homepage in my content editing in Uniform, I can say if this signal is fired or it has a certain score, let me just render another component. So in the Uniform interface, you can just say, okay, I have set up a few signals that I think are important. Maybe somebody likes a specific product category, so they go there 4 times. Well, that's a specific signal that you send, right? So it scores a little bit of points. So essentially, you can have for multiple different signals and actions that people do, you have different points scales. And based on that, different components are rendered in the page. So you can do a hyper personalized page based on the actions of the user. Okay, so that's how we do it in the front end with JavaScript. So you can literally just click around and your page totally changes based on your actions that you made without having made too many rules. Of course, you need to know if somebody likes this, I'm going to render that. That's pretty normal in personalization.
Hmm.
So when you have that in place, the problem is when you load the page the first time and you have to figure out with JavaScript what all the points are that people had from last week, you see a screen flicker a little bit. So we change the component suddenly, and that's not great. It works for subsequent page clicks because when
Hmm.
you keep clicking, something becomes a single page app and it's super fast. But what if on the server side of things, you can already have something pre-personalized,
Mm.
send it to the user and the JavaScript attaches later. Suddenly it is already personalized. So you don't see screen flickering, no flashing, none of it. And that's what we do rather than in an origin server in the backend. This is what lots of legacy personalization would do,
Yeah.
where you would take 5 seconds to figure out what all the rules are. Let me render something and send it back. That is not something that works. And but if you do it on the edge and it's fast
Mm.
enough, if the way you wrote your code, you can really do that. And so what Uniform does is it looks at the cookies in the session of the user, gets that information in that little middleware function I was just talking about. When you go to a page, there's an edge handler. You get all the information about the user and you figure out, hey, there's these scores. We just collected these last week.
Hmm.
And then on the server, we just swap certain components based on whatever Uniform has in their personalization tool on the side, stream them in, and then return the page. And that's the simplest I'm going to give it to you. You can go to the Uniform documentation to see a few graphs of how that would work. It's all on there.
Hmm.
The interesting bit is that we can do maybe 15 CMSs and a few different systems all on one page, then personalize everything in a visual way, and then still have a 50 millisecond page load.
Yeah. I think
Which is
that,
insane. This does not
yeah.
exist. That's why it took me so long to explain it.
And I think that's kind of one of the things that most people don't really think about when they think about personalization, especially how it's done with older systems. It's very slow because there is a lot of computation that needs to happen behind
Exactly.
that. And one of the problems with personalization is typically you're dealing with small amounts of uplift, right? Like, okay, we're going to personalize this thing and we're going to get 5% uplift, and over $1 million. Yeah, that's $50,000. It's
Exactly.
worth,
It's not bad.
it's not bad. But the flip side of that is if your time to deliver that page falls dramatically, you will actually lose users and lose revenue. And
You lose
so
even more. Yeah, exactly.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so this is one of the problems with personalization that most people don't consider, is that when you're doing it, it's kind of like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that once you start to do personalization, if your performance gets into that zone of affecting the revenue, the you'll actually have a net loss. And so,
Exactly.
yes, you'll be personalizing, but you're going to be losing a lot of people in the
Well,
process.
and what's interesting here is you can do it. Like, look at Amazon. They have
Mhm.
perfected this and it's still fast and it still works. But not everybody is Amazon, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. Not everybody is Netflix that does a personalization thing, or Shopify or Spotify. With Uniform, for the price that you pay, everybody can do this. And
Yeah.
content editors can visually say this component comes here, this one comes here. based on whatever thing was just said. And it's a different move into that field. And using the edge for it feels like, for us having been in this space doing this personalization bit for a while,
Hmm.
it felt like the most organic move to do it that way. But then when we were discussing this with the Netlifys and Vercels and Cloudflares of this world, they looked at how we used their edge and they're like, we had never anticipated anybody ever wanted to do it this way. This is awesome. And for us, it was so normal due to the nature of how Uniform works.
Hmm.
And that's why sometimes it's a little bit hard to explain. It took me like a good 5 minutes. But once you see it in play, it's crazy, because we then also integrate with a whole bunch of systems like CRMs and CDPs and
Hmm.
something like Sixth Sense that looks at IP ranges and emails of people. You can go to the Uniform website when you are, let's say, you work at Algolia or you work at Content Stack or one of our partners. The homepage will be catered to you, and you would not know it any different, because it's like a normal website. It's that fast. You don't even realize it was personalized for you. And if you do that the right way and you put that on e-commerce or on events websites, it's unbeatable. Like, how often have you bought a ticket for something, for a conference, and you go back to the website and ask you to buy a ticket again? Actually, that's stupid. It should tell you you already bought this ticket, or you have something in your bag and you clicked on this link 5 times. Maybe you want to buy it.
Hmm.
Those kind of like these three things that I just gave you. If you want to do that with traditional personalization tools, you see product owners, developers, everybody start to cry, because it's just maybe in version 6 of this site, right? And for Uniform, it's just there. You literally did that with 4 clicks. And so
Yeah.
it's a game changer, and it's using the edge, and it's super modern and hip, and I really enjoy that part.
Well, and I think I'll take this opportunity to tie it back to something that we were talking about earlier,
Yeah, we
and
should, because we
the
went away from CDNs and APIs there.
yeah. No, no, I mean, this was part of the agenda to discuss, but it's, as we're discussing that and we're talking about underlying content systems that may not have good performance, Uniform can also improve the performance of consuming content from those systems as well. Because everything that we're talking about for those systems and pipelines for personalization also just applies to content in general, right?
Actually, we should say this, because we are using the edge for something else as well at Uniform.
Yep.
So what we have now is, I'll keep it short because we're flying through the time here. Basically, in Uniform, you can add data sources to Uniform. So you make your composition, you have your design components, and then these external data sources, you can literally say, this title field needs to come from that source, that field. And then this image needs to come from that PIM, that field. And this other text or this list of items needs to come from this specific API endpoint, right? So you're pointing to things. But then what Uniform does is, rather than storing the output of that whole API endpoint, what a lot of systems do, we don't. We still point to it. And so what we save is something very light. If we just have pointers to data resources and fields. And then when you actually hit the Uniform endpoint from your front end, then you hit a CDN edge close to you.
Hmm.
And on that edge, we have actually figured out from that data resource ID for that field what that field is, and we put that in the JSON for you. So we store a very curated a list of JSON specific to your components and their properties, and that sits on the edge. So we have, like, I don't know, if you're in San Francisco, you have like a 6 millisecond response to something that might have 15 data sources, because we almost like, it's like a curated form of things that we need. We put it together and then we cache it for you. And then, of course, the developers in this stream might say, hey, but then are you just cloning the cache, or how does that work? And so we can actually have per field time to live
Hmm.
and webhooks. So when you publish something in your CMS, the webhook would go to Uniform and we would just uncache that little 3 fields that you used. And so that is insane. Again, doesn't exist, right? So DXC is next level with Uniform, and this is kind of the thing we're doing. And it's the edge is basically like, it's right place, right time. The
Yeah.
tools like the edge that exist now make us so successful in doing these things. Before, it would have been a lot harder.
Well, and I think, I know we've just got a minute, but I think to sum up, that's probably one of the biggest takeaways, is that the world used to be very binary, server side, client side, and now it's much more of a spectrum to say, okay,
Yeah.
server side, client side, things like digital experience composition and uniform, things like edge compute. There's a lot of different functions and a lot more sort of variety in what's being served when and where. And
Exactly.
it adds complexity for people to understand, and certainly that's why we're doing things like producing this guide and having these videos. But
Yeah.
hopefully people can understand the potential of the things that Tim was talking about in terms of, okay, now it means that the performance becomes much easier. It becomes much easier to manage and understand, and actually deliver those things.
Exactly. It's a magical time to work in the content space, I think.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a great summary.
that might be the ending bombshell. So feel free, everyone, to look at this URL or scan this QR code to find our evaluation guide of composable CMSs, where we basically, what we speak about here is a wider ranging thing, but all the core concepts are written in this guide. So you can learn a lot from that, or fully disagree and then talk to us. We love that too.
Yeah, and to Tim's point, um, the guide has a lot of the stuff at a high level, but really for the details, we're getting into these live streams. If we were to have all of that level of detail in the guide, it would be a
You
book,
would not
not a
want to
guide.
read it.
You would
No,
not want to read it.
no,
So,
exactly.
take the guide, pick and choose those things that you need to understand conceptually for those use cases, and then for the specific topics, come see us as we discuss these things on our live stream going forward.
All right. I think we are at the hour exactly, or a bit over.
Just a bit
Anyways,
over.
thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you next Tuesday, right?
Yes, on Headless
Exactly.
Creator.
Same time on Headless Creator. Cheers,
Yeah.
everyone.